Um, you know, trying to figure out what to talk about, you brought up, the mental health of young folks and looking through a lot of your material. Yeah, obviously that's a big interest of yours. And I guess not to use hyperbole, but what could be more important than, the next generation of kids coming up, and it's going to be the future of our society, right? And they're not doing well, I think is what it seems like the theme is. Now we'll kind of break that down because I don't know where I kind of got down a little bit of a comparison thing, and you saw it probably in my notes where like, really, is life much harder now? I mean, there's you go back, 50 years, even 100 years. I mean, people couldn't eat, you took depression era stuff. So I don't know if that comparison type thing is a healthy thing. I don't know if it helps or hurts, but that's just kind of where my mind went. But anyway, I guess overall, what do you think's going on? I mean, what's your assessment of kind of the younger generation, what they're going through?
Well, there's no doubt that something is going on,
Hmm.
because the data are very clear and they're coming from everywhere. So we see data on young people. We see increasing rates of subjective measures, psychological distress, like reports of anxiety and depression and low mood.
Hmm.
We also see objective measures like more visits to emergency room for psychological issues, for suicide attempts, and so on. So there's very good evidence that young people are suffering psychologically. Um, a lot of young people report suicidal thoughts. A lot of them report that they don't have friends, that they're lonely, that there's nobody who really knows
Hmm.
them. A lot of them report overwhelming stress and feelings of anxiety and despair. And that has been going up in recent decades. So that evidence is very clear. Now, the first thing you want to do is put it in some context. And the
Yeah.
context is that it's not only young people who are reporting these things, it's older people too. So when you look at their parents, when you look at teenagers and you look at
Hmm.
uh, their parents also report higher rates of stress and depression and anxiety. Um, and we see this also for both sexes. So you see a kind of decline in the mental health of males uh, and a decline in the mental health for females. So across the board, we're seeing a picture that's alarming for many people. And that's the situation. The question, of course, that you're asking is why. And the first part of the question
Hmm.
has to do with the relative nature of stress, which you mentioned, right? So you say, well, what are we complaining about? We're living much better and longer and healthier and safer lives than anyone in
Hmm.
history. And this is true. Objectively speaking, you are much less likely to die in violence than people hundreds of years ago. You're much more likely to live into old age with good health than people in the past. Um, your standard of living is objectively much higher. You have more technology at your fingertips, more knowledge, more access to information, um, more square footage in your home, uh, and
Hmm.
better appliances and
Right.
equipment than anyone in history. So this is true. The question remains, so why are we feeling like, why are so many people feeling like, their lives are not going well? And I think there's some answers to that, because human beings are psychological creatures. And that means we have a strong subjective apparatus that works independently of the objective reality often.
Mm.
And, for good or bad, that's human nature. So several things that can affect your subjective feeling negatively, even if your objective situation is better than before. So, for example, comparison is one of those. Human beings are social animals and we compare ourselves to others. That's one way we know who we are.
Yeah.
And comparison is usually done upward. We are much more likely to compare ourselves to people who have more than to people who have less. In the past, you didn't have so much knowledge and awareness of how the wealthiest, most successful people in the world lived.
Mm.
So you compared yourself to kind of a limited range of outcomes you saw in your proximal environment. So you compared yourself to the most beautiful person in your tribe.
Yeah.
Well, now you're comparing yourself to the most beautiful person in the world
Right.
because you have access to that. And so you don't compare yourself to the person in your tribe who had, more goats than you. You compare yourself to, Jeff Bezos.
Mm.
So in that kind of comparison, a lot of feelings of frustration and anger and despair can emerge
Constant
because I
inadequacy.
have
Yeah.
much less than other people and I'm never going to catch up. And then why is it that I have much less? And why is it that I don't have this great life
Mm.
that some people do? So subjectively, this expansion of the circle of comparison, I think, has to do with how people feel about themselves. I think with that, another reason you see problems is that expectations have risen.
Mm.
Right. So, in the old days, the early Christians did not think that romantic love, feelings of love are a very good thing for a marriage because they're not stable. And you don't want to introduce instability into marriage. And early marriages were a fairly simple contract by which we pull together our resources to raise kids who will then help us work at the farm and so on. And, you know, subsist, survive better as we pool our resources. So there wasn't the expectation that your partner is going to be necessarily that nice to you,
Mm.
or that you're going to have some ecstasy with them, or that they're going to be both, kind and funny and, and loving and
Lots of ands.
sexually.
And. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So now, when you marry someone, the expectations are really high. They're supposed to be your soulmate and your friend and your protector and your lover, and is, have interesting conversations and go interesting places and to know you very well. And well, that's one reason our marriages are fairly fragile, because it's difficult to meet those
Mm.
expectations. So I think our expectations for life have increased. We don't just want to survive, we want to thrive. We don't just want to make ends meet. We want to be rich. We want to,
Yeah.
And when your expectations are very high, they're going to be frustrated. And so you're going to be feeling lousy. And this is a little bit of the paradox of choice
Mm.
that psychologists talk about. When you have a lot of choices, when you have no choices, you don't feel very good. So if you have only one bread to eat all your lives, that's not great. But when you have 200 types of bread to choose from, that's not great either. Because what are the odds you'll pick the right one?
Mm.
1 in 200 is not very good
Right.
odds. So whatever you pick, you're going to have buyer's remorse. You're going to say, maybe I could have picked her. And so our feeling of well-being tends to decrease if we are faced with too many choices. And right now, with the advance of civilization and technology and culture, a byproduct of that is that we are facing very high expectations, and a lot of choices in how to live our lives and what to do and where to go and who to be and so on. Subjectively, that creates stress. So I think that's another reason that people feel the stress. There's just too much going on for them to get a handle of. And then I think there's another issue that is now being spoken of more, which is loneliness. Uh, so, in the old days, yes, life was hard in many ways. But most people lived within a community and spent most of their lives and had most of their connections within that community. This has begun to break down in recent decades. And more people are lonely, not feeling connected to a community, don't have a lot of friends, don't have good connections with the family, maybe moved away, and there's a geographical distance that creates difficulties. And it's a competitive culture. So, becoming friends with someone carries a risk, in a competitive culture. So we're suspicious and less trusting and keeping our distance. And it turns out that loneliness and social isolation, in terms of psychological health and physical health, are as bad for you as many accepted types of risks. So if you are lonely and socially isolated, the effect it has on your longevity is as big or bigger than smoking. So both physically and psychologically, I think the fact that we're more polarized and more lonely and more distant, that has effect on people. So yeah, you're going to live a long life and you have a nice car and you have your phone, but you don't feel intimately connected to anyone. How good will your life be then?
And you think the internet would have changed that, right? The internet did the exact opposite, where you can connect, quote unquote, with more and more people immediately, but have, less and less meaningful relationships. Yeah.
Well, this is interesting. The technology part of it is interesting because, so once we identify that people are feeling worse, and that part of it has to do with, the changes in culture and society and technology and the availability of comparison and the high expectations and the breakdown of community, then you can begin to kind of bore down into some specifics of what causes all of that and what are the kind of active ingredients in that big soup. And technology comes up. In one reason is that particularly the digital media, social networks, and cell phone.
Yep.
One reason is that this decline in mental health with young people coincides very closely with the introduction of the cell phone. So we see that as more Americans get cell phones, smartphones, and have access to social networks, anxiety and depression gradually go up alongside this development. So there's a suspicion that there's something about cell phones and social media involvement that reduces or harms mental health. And people are studying this. It's not that easy to study because social media comes along with a lot of other things together. It's not isolated from other developments and conditions in society. So to find the causal effects here is not that simple.
But generally speaking, yeah, I saw a lot of studies on, I think when the iPhone came out, 05, 06, something like that, there was a lot of general, trends that showed what you're talking about around that time, when that device in your pocket sort of started to become ubiquitous, and folks had that access to whatever it was. The apps were pretty, juvenile at the time, but it seems to be, there's definitely some, correlation at the very least. You would say it seems to be, and it makes
Well,
sense,
I
right? I
think,
mean,
yeah, I think today we know that it's more than a correlation. I
mm,
mean, there's some evidence that social media involvement, because you can manipulate that experimentally to some degree. You can find communities that are similar demographically and
mm,
otherwise, and watch what happened when Facebook was introduced in one community and not in another during the early aughts, and you can see the effects on mental health and so on. And
yeah,
you can also manipulate experimentally, where you can have people take a break from cell phone for a while, and monitor what happens to them, and then reintroduce it and
right,
see.
right,
So there's certain things you can do to show that the effects are more than correlational, that
mm,
there's some negative effects. But what we're finding is that the negative effects tend to cluster in heavy users.
mm,
Um, Casual users may not, mm, you know, suffer adverse effect from cell phone, smartphone, social media, but heavy users fairly clearly take a hit to their mental
mm.
health. And the problem here is that social media is designed to create heavy
By
users.
design, right,
The
right,
technology
yeah,
that the companies make money by getting eyeballs
right,
on the screen for a long time.
right,
So the content is designed not to educate you or help you, but to get you to watch more. And generally, what gets you to watch more is A, stuff that you already agree with, and B, stuff that's extreme.
mm-hmm,
And so you see a lot of extreme stuff that you tend to agree with on your social media. And so people can easily become addicted. And of course, the byproduct of that is that you get a skewed picture of the world,
mm-hmm,
because you don't get to hear the other side,
right,
and you get to see the extreme presented as normal,
right,
whereas the extreme is rare. But if people like to see man bites dog gets clicks because it's rare.
right,
So we can get you man bites dog videos 24/7 for a year, even though it's a very rare occurrence
right, right.
statistically. We can
It's
just
curated just for your
find those
eyeballs.
events.
Yeah,
Yes, we
yeah,
can cure exactly. So it's curated to hijack your attention
mm,
and to get you to view more. And as you get to view more, you begin to suffer the adverse consequences.
mm. So
That's
moderation,
what we're seeing.
moderation is the key. So it seems like it applies here as well.
Yes, but the capitalist society doesn't work by teaching moderation,
Mm-hmm.
right? It tries to maximize profit by maximizing consumption. And so I don't want you to watch here and there. Yeah, think about psychologically, as an aside, think about the likes on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
Likes show up randomly once in a while after you put a post. Okay. And you don't have to do that. That's a choice. They could created the algorithm that says every hour on the hour, you'll see a summary of your
Mm,
likes for your post. Okay. They're not doing that. Now, why not? Well, because if you knew that every hour on the hour you get summary of the likes, then you'll check your phone once an hour,
right.
right? But if you know that likes can show up at any point after you post, then you're going to check your screen repeatedly
Yeah.
throughout the hour. So that kind of that schedule of reinforcement,
Mm-hmm.
what they call technically, rewards repeated engagement, and that's what the companies want. It's done on
Mm.
purpose. So the whole media landscape does not teach moderation, and that's one of the
Mm.
risks.
So if we zoom out, right, this is where I get, because I always like to go, okay, well, how do we solve this sort of thing, right? I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, and they are mired in this. I mean, the iPad. I mean, you would swear it's super glued to their forehead. Um, if you zoom out, and I'm a fan of capitalism because I think it does the world an immense amount of good. But again, there's cost to everything, and in this case, the excess that you're talking about is a product of that system, right? And I think, you know, if you sort of zoom out and you look at incentives, we talked about, I think, on the last episode where we talked about food and hacking, right? Use the word hacking quite a bit, and in fact, I created a bunch of sound bites from our episode because I think you nailed it so well with some of the short sentences. But you know, the the food industry is hacking our palate. They know, salt, fat, sugar, what's going to be more crispy. Doritos are freaking amazing. When's the last time you had a Dorito? It's wonderful. It's freaking wonderful, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't go out of the ground. That is curated to make me want more at all costs, right?
Right.
What right?
Yeah.
I would say pharmaceutical companies do the exact same thing. There's incentive there, right? I'm sure that, again, and there's always a balance. Pharmaceuticals save a lot of lives mentally and physically, but there's an incentive there to
Mm.
keep you on something. I don't care what anyone says. That is an absolute truth. I'm not saying they're all bad actors. I'm not saying that at all, but you could go look at, I don't know, the military industrial complex. There is incentive for war. Sorry, everybody, but there is. I'm in the DoD space. I'm not a hater of that world, but there's incentive. And now we get back to, technology and eyeballs on screens. There's an incentive to keep you from putting it down, from keep looking at it, keep clicking. The games, I look at my, again, I've said this ad nauseum. Sorry, apologize to the listeners, but when I watch my son play these games, every sound and every, I know psychologists, they're not just software engineers. There's psychologists on staff saying, if you make that sound with this color, it's going to spike their dopamine just enough for them to not want to put it down. You could just see it. Speaking to folks like you over the years has absolutely solidified my opinion there. So I guess what I'm getting at is, if we agree that every incentive in our structure is doubling down on this problem, and really, us parents, us as society, are up against a massive system. Now I'm a huge fan of personal responsibility. So I don't like the blame culture. I don't like, well, it's not our fault because of look, but you got a pretty formidable opponent out there that's not going to slow down. So I guess my question would be, given that there's that formidable, system working against what we're talking about, in augmenting and, you know, causing some of this mental decline in young folks just because of the technology, because of social media. What the heck do we do? What's next? Is it just parents, is it just moderation? Is it just, hopefully better technology companies enforcing limits and, or parent, I don't know. There's all that data is out there, and there's ways to do it with apps and stuff, but what the hell, 10, 20 years, what's it going to look like? What do we do?
Well, you know, you're right in your analysis. There's a system here that has
Mm,
incentives uh, to create using patterns that bring profit, not using patterns that bring health or happiness to people. Uh, that's true. And I think the other thing that you point out that's very true, and I think it's very important, is that individuals, individual kids, and parents cannot stand alone against
mm,
such a powerful system and consistently win. This is an error that we keep making when we blame the victim, in a sense, for losing an unfair battle. Um, Let me give you an example. The example I like to give is, if I throw you into the river before you learn how to swim, you will most likely drown. But whose fault is it?
Hmm.
It's not your fault. It's my fault for placing you in an environment with which you are unequipped to cope. So, likewise, you cannot have an environment where information is endlessly available, endlessly novel, endlessly tailored to the individual taste,
Hmm.
and expect individuals to consume responsibly and moderately. That's naive,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a misunderstanding of human psychology. So, increasingly in this environment, our self systems are ill equipped to deal with the technological environments we've created. And no wonder people are distressed. Um, so, the first piece here is to realize that people alone and parents alone trying to stem this tide are going to fail more often than they
Hmm.
succeed. And it's not their fault. It's not because they're bad kids or bad parents. Just like the kid who drowned, it's not his fault that he was a bad swimmer. It's your fault that you threw him in the water. So the first thing is to understand that if we're going to create a healthy environment for individuals, for kids, and for parents, you cannot put the onus of doing it only on the parents and the individuals. That's tempting because it lets the big companies continue to
Hmm.
make money, uh, and it diverts blame from them. But it's completely ineffective if you try to do this, and we know this. So what you will have to do to be effective, you have to think about other social problems. Let's let's think about, we want to limit accident death, car accident death. Okay, what should we do if we're going to be effective in limiting car accident death? You can't just tell the drivers, drive more carefully. You have to do other things. You have to have certain laws that limit who can drive when and where,
Hmm.
and enforce them. You have to create better roads. You have to create better traffic signage. You have to create better
Hmm.
cars. And then you have to create better driver training.
Hmm.
And then you have to disseminate information about the risks of certain kinds of driving, like let's say drunk driving, and educate the public. And you have to give them means. You have to give them weapons to become safer, like the seatbelt and the airbag. And so the same thing will have to happen if you're going to create a healthy social media environment for young people. You can't just tell young people, well, turn off your phone.
Right.
There will have to be a social engagement, in the sense that there's going to have to be regulation and rules about where and when phones can and cannot be used. There will have to be social pressure, just like with smoking. One reason less people are smoking is because we know we disseminated the bad impact of smoking, but also we made it uncool to smoke. It's like the same thing was done with spitting. People used to spit in public, but now they don't, because there's a social sanction
Hmm.
against it. Well, if you create a social sanction against using cell phone in certain situation, now you're helping individual uh, kids and parents manage better. So this is already happening, in certain classrooms. In my classroom, you have to put your phone away where you can't see
Hmm.
it and I can't see it. And in certain comedy shows, they take your phone at the door. Yeah. So there's going to be more, just like we have non-smoking spaces that help reduce smoking. You're going to have non-cell phone use
Mm,
spaces, and that has to. It can't come from individual decisions. It has to come from societal decisions and
mm,
regulations. So to be successful, you'll have to have both a top-down and a ground-up effort. Uh, Individuals need to be empowered and educated, and society has to shift the environment so that individuals can be
mm.
healthy in it. You know, if if everyone around you is smoking everywhere, then your individual decision to not smoke matters not at all.
Right, right,
You see what I'm saying? So long as the social media saturation happens everywhere and with everyone around you and everywhere around you, then your little decision to not look at your phone will
mm,
not matter. There has to be also uh, a change in the environment. This
yeah,
is something we know about the psychology of behavior. A behavior change doesn't happen effectively from just willpower. Uh, it happens from a change in the environment. So if I want to drink less coffee, it's not a smart move for me to continue to
right,
drive to work past my favorite coffee shop and trust my willpower. That's not going to work. I need a new
right,
route where I don't go by a coffee shop. And if I get that new route to be my way to work, I'm going to drink less coffee. So a change in the environment, if you want
yeah,
to eat less candy, have less candy in your home. Uh,
right,
if you have a lot of candy in your home and just tell yourself, I'll just eat less, you're fooling
right, right,
yourself.
right.
It's not going to work. And we know this experimentally. So what I'm saying, you identify the problem correctly, and shifting the blame to individuals and tell them you just turn off your phone and is not going to work.
What you're articulating is so true, but what makes it extra hard is you put down your phone or put down the screen. It's like, well, it's like, a food addict or someone who's trying to lose weight, and obesity is a huge problem in the United States, but it's like you need food to survive. So you can't just say, oh, get rid of food, avoid places with food, don't eat, clear health. If you're alcoholic or you have, problems with hard drugs, you don't need those to survive. You can almost binarily just, not saying it's going to be easier, but at least it's one part of it's easy where you don't need it to survive. So you can try to shut it out of your life. Phones, screens, computers. I think I said in my,
Yeah,
my notes to you, it's like, whether I'm wasting my life away or whether I'm being ultra productive and building a business is one, browser tab
yeah,
away from each other. So it's like, you know, it's
yeah,
sort of like, I've had this conversation with my kids. It's like they see me in front of my screen all day long. I mean, I work from home a lot of days. I'm
yeah,
I'm in the technology field. It's my livelihood. Um, so, I'm trying to show that balance of, well, no, this depends on what you use it for. If I'm mindlessly scrolling through, you know, YouTube shorts or TikTok, well, yeah, I'm just, that's one thing. Or I'm watching a TED talk, completely different. So,
yeah.
you're right. The moderation and put the phone away is a part of the answer. But man, it's and a lot of these young folks are actually running businesses from their phone. I mean, it's amazing. These influencers, they're doing very well. They're ingenious. I mean, it's amazing. So that makes it even harder because it's so hard to just push away completely.
Absolutely. No, our thinking here is not
Mm,
anti-technology. Cell phone, social media are in some regards wonderful inventions, and they can do a lot of good, and they do a lot of good. I think you're right in characterizing this issue. It's a dial issue, not a switch issue. So you can divide the issues we face into dial and switch issues. Switch issue is
yeah.
either or. It's yes or no. It's
Mm,
binary. And there are some issues in life that are like that, that you use it or you don't use it. And that's the solution and
Yeah.
that's the approach. And that's possible. But most issues in life are dial issues.
Yeah.
Like you say, with food, you have to eat. And it's the same with technology. You have, in order to survive
Mm.
in this culture and thrive, you have to be technologically educated and savvy, and you have to use it.
Yeah.
Um, dial issues, which this is one of these issues, they basically raise two questions. The first is where to place the dial. So you don't
Mm.
need, many things are good until we have too much of them. So, light is really good for us, allows us to see. Too much light will blind you. So you just have to dial the light level to the level that helps you function and not dial it up to the dysfunctional and damaging level. And it's the
Mm.
same here. The goal is not to get rid of technology, just like the goal is not to get rid of medication, and the goal is not to get rid of food. You know. But the goal is to dial it down to a level where it's functional as opposed to dysfunctional. That's the task. And that's one side of it. And the other side, like you say, is a question of how we use the technology we have. So it's the same with food. What do you use food for? If you're using food to, get nutrients and to have some pleasure, that's great. If you're using food to try to numb your emotional pain,
Mm.
that's a failing strategy on both counts. You will end up eating in ways that are damaging, and your emotional situation will deteriorate.
Mm.
So there's a question of how we use the stuff that we're using, and it's the same with technology. Like you say, if you spend most of your time using technology to ends of building your business or actually connecting with people or learning about the world, um, then that's okay. Even if you use a lot of technology for that
Mm.
reason, that's still okay. But if most of your use is of the more sort of compulsive, mindless, avoidant
Right.
type, then you're going to damage yourself in the long run. So when you try to figure this out, you have to look at both levels of use and also the purpose of use, the type of use, and try to adjust both.